The war was nearly over. Europe was dissolving into silence, but it was a silence that felt wrong. A silence filled not with peace, but with exhaustion, ruin, and the residue of unimaginable noise. It was late April of 1945, somewhere between the broken rail lines of Western Germany and the wreckage of retreating armies. The weather was cold, sharp, metallic. The ground was wet, soaked with months of rain, artillery impact, and winter rot. The sky held low gray clouds that pressed downward like the weight of a tomb lid. No birds, no engines in the distance, no gunfire, only the echo of boots through abandoned countryside. The American armored column moved cautiously along a damaged rural road, engines humming beneath canvas and steel. Mud splashed against wheels and tracks. Faces were pale beneath helmets, eyes narrowed behind dust-scratched goggles. These soldiers had been fighting continuously since Normandy. They had crossed France, Belgium, and the shattered Ardennes. Many carried the memories of Bastogne, Hurtgen, Cologne. They had seen cities burn and forests torn open by fire. They had driven deeper into Germany than any of them once imagined possible. And now they pushed into a landscape that felt hollowed out, like the aftermath of a storm. Villages stood abandoned, windows broken, fields unplowed, churches without bells, roads filled with rubble and splintered beams. A defeated nation retreating into silence. Their orders were simple: secure transport infrastructure to block any final attempts by remaining German forces to reposition artillery, troops, or escape routes. The Wehrmacht and SS were falling apart, fragmenting into isolated pockets, still trying to fight or flee. Railroad lines remained valuable. Trains could still carry weaponry, gold, documents, prisoners, or entire command staffs if allowed to slip away. The Americans were told to assume nothing was harmless anymore. The column halted near a junction where the forest closed tightly around the tracks. The air smelled of pine and cold iron. A scouting jeep advanced along the line cautiously, its engine subdued against the surrounding stillness. The track led into a shallow cutting between slopes of dark soil and tangled roots. The area felt wrong immediately. Too quiet, too clean, too stage-like, as though something waited behind a curtain. The jeep rounded the bend. What they saw made every man fall silent. There, sitting motionless on the rails, was a massive German armored train, dozens of cars long, steel plates welded over windows, gun turrets sealed, heavy-lift flatbeds chained to covered wagons. The locomotive at the front, black and monumental, leaned slightly as though frozen mid-stride. It looked abandoned, yet not destroyed, intact, but not functioning. The paint was dark and streaked with rust. The insignia marked it clearly: property of the Third Reich. A machine built not for passengers, but for war. The Americans approached slowly, weapons ready, boots crunching on gravel. The sheer size of the train looked unreal after weeks of ruined landscapes. It felt like a ghost, a relic from a world that should no longer exist. Every soldier sensed immediately that this was no ordinary captured equipment. This train had purpose. It had weight. It held secrets. The locomotive's cab was empty. No crew. No bodies. No blood. Tools lay scattered across the metal floor, as if someone had left in the middle of work. The coal bunker still held fuel. The firebox was cold, but recently cleaned. Someone had prepared for departure, then vanished. The infantry spread out along the length of the train. The wagons were sealed with heavy locking mechanisms, welded edges, reinforced doors braced from inside. Some carried thick riveted armor designed to withstand artillery impact. Others were covered entirely by tarpaulin, straps pulled tight, surfaces unmarked. One wagon had a ventilated hatch, bolted shut. Another bore strange white stenciling that none recognized. No labeling, no manifest, no destination painted on the sides. The silence around the train felt oppressive, like the weight of a long-held breath. The officers studied the scene. Why would such a machine be left intact? Why were there no guards, no explosives, no sign of sabotage? Everything appeared designed for extreme protection, yet the owners had walked away. Logic failed to explain it. German command was collapsing, but secrecy remained absolute. Whatever lay inside this train mattered enough to move under armor protection. Yet something had forced abandonment, something stronger than duty, stronger than fear of capture. The Americans began searching the surrounding terrain. The forest closed in on both sides, thick trunks rising straight toward the gray ceiling of cloud. The landscape felt newly disturbed. Torn earth, boot prints, scattered discarded equipment half hidden in mud. A sense of recent movement, tracks from a vehicle leading into the woods and then fading. The wind carried the smell of old smoke, faint but unmistakable. One soldier found a corpse partially buried under leaves. A Wehrmacht officer. No weapon, no wounds. Face frozen in the expression of a man who had seen something too terrible to comprehend. Nearby, another body. Then another. None showed signs of combat. No bullet holes. No blood trails. As if they had simply fallen and died of fear or exhaustion. As if they had run from something that did not fire a shot. The Americans regrouped. The commanding officer ordered the perimeter secured. Machine gun nest positioned. Mortar crews ready. Engineers summoned to examine the welded doors. Radio men attempted contact with headquarters, but static filled the air. The forest swallowed sound like a sponge. Even the engines felt muted. The soldiers walked the full length of the train again. They moved slowly, breath visible in the cold air, fingers tightening on weapons. The longer they observed it, the more unnatural it appeared. No train this large traveled alone. No escort vehicles. No infantry support. No air cover. Not when the front was collapsing and desperation guided every decision. And certainly not when transporting something of immense importance. Every sealed wagon became a rectangular question. What was worth such protection? The war was almost over. Berlin was already being carved apart by artillery and street fighting. Leaders were fleeing or dying. Millions displaced. Cities turned to ash. Yet here, in a forgotten forest corridor, a colossal train sat waiting like a coffin. Rumors circulated quietly among the American soldiers. Some believed it was treasure, the stolen gold of Europe, melted down in the fires of occupied banks. Others spoke of stolen art from museums emptied by the Reich. Some whispered about secret weapons, prototypes, documents that could reshape what came after victory. And darker voices muttered about human cargo. Prisoners removed before liberation could expose unspeakable crimes. But the truth remained locked behind steel. The commanding officer approached the first armored door. The metal was thick, cold, solid beneath his glove. Weld lines glistened. Whatever had been sealed inside was never meant to see daylight again. He placed his ear to the uncompromising surface. There was nothing. No sound. No movement. Empty or not, no one could tell. Engineers examined the welds. Cutting through would take time. They prepared tools from their trucks, setting up equipment along the gravel shoulder. Sparks soon followed, drifting like fireflies into the mist. While they worked, the soldiers kept watch, eyes constantly scanning the tree. The atmosphere felt stretched, tense, electric. Something about the place caused the air to thicken. The forest seemed to lean inward as though listening. No one spoke loudly. No one joked. They felt as though someone, or something, watched from beyond the trees. One sergeant walked along the final wagons. Near the end of the convoy, a small latch door was discovered near the base of one car, partially concealed by grime. It was locked from the outside. A vent pipe extended upward. The design suggested containment rather than transport. Something living? The sergeant pressed his ear to the cold metal. Inside, faintly, impossibly, something moved. He stepped back, breath held, eyes fixed on the door. Pale light trembled on his face. The wind rose briefly and then died. The engineers continued grinding and cutting, metal shrieking under sparks. The steel glowed orange along the cut. The soldiers backed away as the door finally shifted. Chains clattered. Hinges strained. The heavy plate swung slowly outward, releasing a burst of frozen, stale air carrying the smell of age and confinement. Light from a flashlight cut through the darkness inside. Dust swirled. The beam revealed rows. Stacks. Piles of wooden crates, each marked with cryptic symbols. No labels. No numbering. Just black stamps burned into the wood. The smell was musty, ancient, and chemical, as if sealed for decades. Another soldier stepped in, lifting the lid of a nearest crate. Inside, wrapped in fabric, lay a small metal container. Cylindrical. Sealed. Without markings except a faint code etched by hand. More crates beneath. All identical. An uneasy silence spread. No one understood what they were looking at. Then, from deeper inside the train, another sound emerged. A low metallic clatter, followed by something else, a dull, rhythmic knocking. Slow, measured, like the distant heartbeat of a buried machine. Flashlights converged. Eyes widened. The knocking continued. Something, or someone, was still alive inside the sealed darkness. The soldiers froze. Fear crawled through the air like smoke. The sound was unmistakable, persistent, desperate, a signal from inside a prison of steel and silence. They looked at each other without speaking. If the first wagon held crates, what did the others hold? The engineers moved to the second car. Tools screamed against metal again. Sparks cascaded. Every second felt enormous. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, more human. The officer hesitated. His breath steamed in the cold air. His hand trembled slightly on his weapon. He gave the order to continue. The sun began to break through the clouds, thin light falling across the train. The weld lines glowed bright as the metal barrier weakened. Soldiers steadied themselves. No one knew what waited beyond the door, only that whatever they found would not be simple cargo. The knocking intensified, echoing like trapped thunder. The final cut broke. The second door sagged and fell outward, and what the Americans saw inside that sealed black chamber, in that instant of harsh white flashlight glare and stunned silence, would shock the world, change the understanding of the war, and stain the conscience of nations for generations. The first scream came from the dark. The horizon seemed to collapse. The world stopped breathing. Flashlights cut into the darkness like blades, stabbing through stale air that seemed to resist illumination. Inside the second chamber, the beam trembled, slicing across shapes that did not make sense immediately to the human eye. The soldiers' boots pressed against the steel threshold, breath held tight, weapons raised though no enemy could be seen. The sound that had moments earlier resembled knocking was now something else, ragged scraping, the abrupt thud of flesh against metal, a desperate rhythm that carried not mechanical precision, but human terror. The light widened, the darkness peeled back, and every man who stood at the doorway felt his body tense with instinct rather than thought. What lay inside was not cargo at all. It was people. Rows of narrow metal compartments stretched the length of the wagon, stacked 3 high like industrial storage lockers. Hinged fronts bolted shut, small slotted vents punched into each door, stained with condensation and the marks of hands that had clawed from within. The interior smelled of sweat, blood, urine, and something that could only be described as despair aged into the air itself. The compartments were barely large enough to hold a person curled into a ball, yet they had been filled. The soldiers froze as the reality sank in. These were human containment cells designed not for transport, but confinement. The knocking grew louder now that the outer shell was open, voices muffled behind metal, gasping for air, the sound of fists pounding until knuckles split. Someone screamed again, and this time it was not a sharp cry of shock, but a long, fractured wail that tore through the silence and hollowed out the hearts of every man who heard it. The Americans rushed forward, hands fumbling across latches and bolts. Tools slammed against hinges. Keys were searched for, but none existed. The metal creaked under effort until one compartment burst open. A body tumbled forward, so light it seemed weightless. A skeletal figure wrapped in rags and sores, skin stretched thin across bones, eyes sunken into the skull, yet blazing with primal terror. He collapsed into the arms of a soldier, who nearly dropped him from shock at how little he weighed. The man tried to speak, but his tongue was swollen, his breath a wet rattle. He clutched the soldier's sleeve with fingers like bird claws, trying to form a word that dissolved into a whimper. The Americans stared in paralyzed silence. They had seen death endlessly, but this was something beyond the battlefield. This was engineered suffering, systematic starvation, the reduction of human beings into cargo units. More compartments burst open. More bodies spilled out, some alive barely, others limp, a few unmoving entirely, trapped in metal coffins until the end. The first conscious survivor gasped a phrase none understood, spoken in a trembling mix of languages. One word repeated clearly, broken but unmistakable: kinder, children. The soldiers looked inside the next open cell and froze. A boy of perhaps 14, though his size suggested far younger from starvation, stared back with pupils blown wide, hair shorn, wrists bruised from restraints. He did not try to speak. He simply watched with a vacant expression that revealed the absence of anything human left to feel. Behind him, another child, younger still, leaned against the wall, barely breathing. The Americans shouted for medics, for blankets, for water. Canteens were unscrewed. Trembling hands guided drops past clenched teeth. Some survivors gagged. Others cried without sound. One soldier fell to his knees and retched violently. None of them had expected this. They thought they understood what war meant. They thought they had seen the worst. But nothing prepared them for a train filled with the remains of living ghosts. Several wagons down, the engineers were already cutting into the next cars. Their movements were mechanical now, driven by urgency rather than caution. Sparks flew in a frantic cascade. Soldiers clustered near the doors. Adrenaline sharpened into something hard and brittle. No one spoke except in clipped commands. The forest around them remained unnervingly still, as though nature itself recoiled from what was being unveiled. When the next door fell open, the flashlight beams swept forward, and instead of compartments or crates, the light struck rows of shelves stacked floor to ceiling with sealed metal cylinders, identical to those found in the first wagon. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Every container marked with code rather than name. No paperwork. No context. The air inside smelled chemical and dry, like a laboratory storeroom rather than a transport hold. The soldiers stepped carefully, afraid to disturb anything. Weapons lowered but breath held tight, as if the slightest movement might unleash something poisonous. The commanding officer ordered a halt, calling for specialists. None were present. They were alone in a forest with a train that held both victims and something else entirely. The discovery forced a horrifying question. Were the people in the previous car connected to the sealed cylinders stacked here? One of the soldiers, shaking, lifted a container slightly and found it heavier than expected, as if filled with liquid or dense powder. The code etched into the metal appeared almost hastily applied, not factory standard. The air tasted metallic, stinging the nose. The officer ordered everyone out. The wagon was sealed again until experts could be summoned. The third wagon was opened next, tools screaming again against welded seams. The soldiers braced themselves for more horror, but what they found was different. There were no compartments, no crates. Instead, the interior held bundles of tightly wrapped frames, stacks of paintings, sculptures encased in protective cloth, gilded icons, canvases removed from their stretchers and rolled carefully in linen, gold-leafed religious figures, marble fragments, masterpieces stripped from museums and private collections across Europe, war trophies of the Reich, stolen culture destined never to return to the world. Names written in delicate pencil marked the backs: Munich, Warsaw, Paris. Entire civilizations packed into a metal womb. The soldiers walked among the artifacts stunned, recognizing titles whispered in newspapers, heritage stolen from peoples who no longer existed to reclaim them. They knew they stood before a vault of beauty hidden inside a machine of horror. The contrast struck deeper than any battlefield loss. The same hands that tortured children protected paintings with reverence. It felt obscene. It felt monstrous. It felt like the logic of a regime that worshipped objects and discarded lives like rubbish. The next wagon revealed shelves lined with boxes of currency, gold bullion packed into crates, sacks of coins bearing the crests of conquered nations. The estimated weight alone was staggering. Fortunes stolen from plundered banks and emptied vaults. Evidence not of ideology, but of greed. The scale was overwhelming. It was a treasury on steel wheels, capable of financing armies, buying safe passage, or sustaining fugitives. Some soldiers stared at it with disbelief. Others turned away in disgust. The war had taught them much, but this train illuminated its darkest truth, that behind every speech and banner and marching anthem lay calculation and theft. The engineers proceeded to the fifth wagon. The cutting took longer. The weld lines were thicker, the steel reinforced with double plating. When the final hinge broke, the soldiers stepped inside cautiously. The air was colder here, controlled. Long metal tables lined both sides, holding instruments, surgical equipment, glass containers sealed with wax. Records lay stacked neatly, bound with string, written in dense columns of scientific notation. Photographs spread across a central workspace, blurred images of human forms restrained to metal frames, limbs measured, organs exposed. The Americans backed away instinctively. What they saw was unmistakable, evidence of medical experimentation, torture conducted under the guise of research. The train was not merely carrying prisoners or gold or art. It was carrying the machinery of a system built to dissect humanity in the name of progress. The officer ordering the search clenched his jaw until his teeth ground against each other. Every man in the room felt a tightening sensation, a suffocating pressure that made breathing painful. The silence in the wagon felt like a tomb of knowledge that should never have existed. Someone whispered a prayer. Another slammed his fist against the wall, unable to contain rage that had nowhere to go. The sixth wagon was sealed with chains wrapped so tightly around the doors that cutting equipment snapped twice. Sparks showered as steel gave way. Everyone stepped back as the door creaked open. This time there was no sound from inside. No knocking. No breath. The flashlight beam pushed into the dark and found bodies. Dozens. Arranged in rows on the floor, covered by sheets that had once been white, but were now stained brown and black. Dead for days or weeks. The soldiers recoiled. Some fled outside to vomit. Others stood frozen until the body count became a blur. No identification. No records. No reason. Only the evidence of silence and abandonment. Outside, the survivors from the second wagon lay wrapped in blankets, medics working with frantic intensity. Some clung to consciousness. Others slipped away even as they were held. No one knew their names. No one knew how many wagons remained unopened. The forest pressed inward, clouds thickened, and the temperature seemed to drop as if the world itself recoiled. The seventh wagon was opened last before darkness forced a stop. The beam of light swept across a cavernous interior arranged like a mobile archive. Rows of file cabinets, shelves filled with bound ledgers, maps rolled into tubes, boxes labeled in code. A table in the center held a large folder marked only with a single black eagle stamped in wax. The commanding officer lifted the flap slowly. Inside, documents detailed transport schedules, coded communications, project names, scientific directives, lists of prisoners by number, not by name. No human identity. Only data. Only logistics. Only calculations. The officer shut the folder and looked around the group. His face was white. He gave orders quietly. Everything was to be secured, guarded, cataloged. No soldier was to speak of what they had seen. Reinforcements would arrive at dawn. Until then, the train would not be touched again. The sun was gone. The cold deepened. The trees stood black against the fading sky. The train no longer seemed a machine but an altar to darkness, a steel monument to cruelty beyond language. The Americans sat in silence around their makeshift perimeter, backs against sandbags and ammunition crates, eyes unfocused. They did not speak. They did not sleep. They simply breathed the heavy air that carried the smell of rust and death. The survivors moaned quietly beneath blankets, their voices too weak to form words. Medics worked under dim lamps, hands shaking, morphine rationed, fear etched into every gesture. Some soldiers walked the perimeter compulsively, unable to stay still. Others stared at the train with expressions emptied of emotion, drained by the weight of reality pressing against their minds. For months they had fought armies, tanks, planes, divisions. They had measured victory by terrain and enemy casualties. They thought war was about strategy, tactics, and courage. But here, beside the silent forest and the dark train, whose contents stretched beyond comprehension, they understood something terrible. War was not about the living fighting the living. It was about the powerful crushing the powerless, unseen, unspoken, sealed away in darkness where no witness could survive to tell the story. Night fell completely. The train loomed like a black fortress against the faint glow of distant fire on the horizon. Somewhere far off, artillery rumbled, the dying heartbeat of a collapsing empire. The soldiers watched the sky and felt nothing. They understood now why the German guards had fled. Whatever loyalty or ideology they once held had dissolved before the weight of what they transported. Some horrors were too great even for the men who created them to stand near when the light returned. The officer sat alone with a folder, staring at the seal pressed into the wax. He traced the edges of the eagle with one finger, the emblem of a regime crumbling into ruin. He wondered how many trains existed, how many wagons of treasure, bodies, documents, how many secrets had already vanished into fire or deep earth. He wondered what the world would say if it saw what he now knew. He closed the folder, placing it gently on his knee, and whispered a sentence that no one heard. Morning would bring the world closer to seeing, and what waited in the unopened wagons would fracture the final illusions about the war. They had not yet discovered the worst. Dawn came slowly, as if reluctant to expose what darkness had kept hidden. A pale gray light crept across the forest floor, revealing mist that clung low to the ground like smoke from a burned-out city. The trees stood silent and unmoving, their branches brittle with frost. The armored train, stretching across the rails like a steel serpent, appeared even more colossal in daylight, its cars glistening with dew, its surfaces scarred by cutting tools, its black paint absorbing the cold morning air like a sponge drawing in blood. The perimeter of American soldiers, slumped against their gear and foxholes, looked older than daylight, faces hollow, eyes rimmed red. They had not slept. They had crossed a threshold that separated not just night from morning, but ignorance from knowledge. The world before the train felt unreal now, like a memory belonging to someone else. Reinforcements arrived from headquarters shortly after sunrise. Additional infantry, intelligence officers, military police, medical transports, and a group of specialized personnel whose uniforms carried no identifying insignia. Their jeeps rolled to a stop, engines idling briefly before cutting out, the silence returning heavier than before. Orders were issued quietly. Guards took positions along the length of the train. Photographers unpacked equipment. Medics hurried to the survivors lying under tarps, now barely clinging to breath. Some had died during the night, bodies covered gently and placed in neat rows beside the tracks. Each face carried the unmistakable imprint of suffering beyond the limits of endurance. The Americans watched as stretchers lifted them onto ambulances destined for field hospitals further west. The fate of the living depended now on time, resources, and luck. The fate of the dead depended on memory. No one spoke as the specialists approached the sealed wagons. The engineers returned to their tools, preparing to cut open the next in the sequence. Every man present understood they were not simply opening containers. They were excavating truth buried under steel. The cutting wheel shrieked. Sparks fell in showers along the ground. The metal glowed bright beneath concentrated heat. When the door finally broke free with a thunderous metallic crack, the soldiers braced themselves. Breath paused, shoulders tightened. The flashlights swept forward. Inside, a cavernous space revealed row upon row of metal canisters mounted into brackets along both walls and ceiling, connected by insulated tubing that ran into large cylindrical vats bolted to the floor. Gauges rusted in place. Thermometers shattered and frozen at impossible readings. A faint chemical odor lingered, sharp enough to sting the throat. Labels handwritten on parchment strips indicated sequences of numbers, temperatures, and coded references that meant nothing to the men reading them. Near the center stood a glass containment chamber, large enough to hold a human body upright. Its walls were fogged from residue. Something had once been inside it, something no longer there. A shape outlined faintly in grease and dry condensation suggested a human form pressed against the glass with enough force to warp its surface. The officers exchanged glances heavy with dread. The car was sealed again immediately, guarded under strict orders, documented in silence. The next wagon exposed a different kind of horror. Shelves of photographic albums, arranged meticulously by date and location, chronicling operations across Europe. City names written in precise pen strokes: Warsaw, Lublin, Kiev, Minsk, Belgrade, Prague, Vienna, Paris, each containing hundreds of photographs showing the transformation of communities into prisons, executions disguised as relocations, streets emptied under armed escort, camps rising from fields that once held life. The Americans flipped page after page until the images became unbearable, each one more grotesquely mundane than the last. No blood, no fire, just cold efficiency, bureaucratic annihilation captured without emotion. The officers closed the albums and wrapped them tightly, sealing them for transport. Evidence now rested not in rumor or testimony, but in captured detail laid bare. When they opened the next wagon, the light illuminated stacks of steel footlockers, marked with coded insignia. Inside each lay collections of identification documents, passports, birth certificates, graduation diplomas, marriage licenses, confiscated from millions of civilians erased from legal existence. Names crossed out with red pencil, professions, addresses, entire family histories reduced to paper destined to be burned. The soldiers held the documents as if they might shatter. They read names of people they would never meet, lives canceled without violence, erased cleanly by ink and classification. War had always been portrayed as battles and rifles and flags. But here war revealed its true face: bookkeeping. The next car opened revealed stacked uniform bundles, boots sorted by size, children's shoes piled into mountains, threadbare clothing stripped from bodies never returned to their owners. The smell was overpowering: mold, leather, human sweat. Some soldiers turned away immediately. Others stared in silence at the tiny pairs of shoes, some pink, some brown, each a monument to a child who had once walked, run, laughed, cried. War severed not only life, but memory. Here memory was compressed into objects too small to comprehend without breaking. 3 additional wagons contained bones, not arranged, not buried, not recorded, just piled. Limbs and ribs and skulls mixed indiscriminately. Remnants of lives consumed by an engine of annihilation that cared nothing for identity. Even hardened infantrymen experienced their resolve dissolve. Some collapsed to their knees, hands covering faces streaming with tears they did not feel fall. Others walked out into the trees and screamed into the void. A medic stood motionless for several minutes before returning to his duties, with movements mechanical and empty. Whatever justification had once been given for this war, liberation, revenge, strategy, victory, now felt feeble and obscene. The reason no longer mattered. Only the reality of those bones mattered. The final sealed wagon was the one no one wanted to open. Soldiers clustered around as the cutting discs shrieked and threw sparks in sweeping arcs. The metal resisted fiercely, as if trying to protect its contents from exposure. When the door finally cracked open, it groaned like a dying animal. The interior was almost completely dark. The flashlight's beam flickered across rows of metal cages. Inside each cage lay a body, some wrapped in cloth, some naked, some tiny, some grotesquely deformed, limbs twisted, faces contorted, evidence of surgical alteration, grafting, mutilation, failed experiments, stored like discarded prototypes. The bodies nearest the front had eyes open, staring blankly through frost-coated wire. Silent witnesses. The soldiers stepped back instinctively as if struck. Air fled their lungs. A sense of suffocation spread. No one moved. No one spoke. The flashlight fell from one soldier's hand and clattered across the metal floor, the sharp noise echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. Several men retreated, stumbling into daylight, gasping for breath, tearing off helmets and gloves with trembling hands. Others remained as if nailed in place, unable to look away or step closer. The commanding officer ordered the car sealed. It would be opened only under the supervision of war crimes investigators. Until then, it remained untouched. A coffin within a coffin. By late afternoon, the scene around the train felt like a battlefield with no enemy. Ambulances carried away survivors and bodies alike. Officers cataloged items for transport to intelligence centers. Photographers recorded everything with cameras that clicked like distant gunfire. Guards stood rigid, rifles resting on chests, eyes fixed forward but unfocused. No one discussed what they had seen. They did not have words. Language had collapsed in the presence of reality. When trucks arrived to begin the removal of documents in crates, a sudden wind swept through the forest, violent enough to bend branches and scatter leaves across the tracks. It howled between the wagons, lifting dust into spirals. The sky darkened abruptly, clouds thickening into a steel-gray mass that swallowed the faint sun. The temperature dropped sharply. Some soldiers later remembered feeling as though the earth itself groaned under the weight of what had been unearthed. The officer in charge walked once more down the length of the train, boots echoing against rails. He paused at each door, hand resting against cold metal, sensing the ghosts trapped inside steel walls now forced into light. He understood that the battlefront he had crossed was not between armies, but between truth and denial. And truth had won, though victory carried no triumph. That night, messages left the forest by encrypted radio. Reports moved up the chain of command. Words like atrocities, mass evidence, and crimes beyond combat appeared in brief descriptions incapable of containing magnitude. Within days, high-ranking officials arrived. Within weeks, journalists were summoned. Within months, the world would see images so devastating that denial would die in public agony. But for now, only those present at the forest understood the full weight. They had stood at the mouth of a grave large enough to swallow nations. When the first press convoy reached the site, cameras rolled across the forest clearing, capturing wagons being unloaded under guard. Reporters watched medics carrying survivors into waiting transports. They photographed small shoes. They filmed bones. They panned across faces of soldiers stripped of bravado. Their coverage ignited shock around the globe. Headlines spoke of horrors beyond imagination, beyond war, beyond humanity. Crowds gathered in silent squares. Mothers wept. Countries demanded justice. Trials were planned. The name of the forest vanished, replaced by the name of the train. Spoken like a warning, a scar burned across history. The news reached Berlin, reached Tokyo, reached Washington and London and Moscow. For some, it confirmed suspicions. For others, it shattered illusions. For millions, it redefined war not as a clash of armies, but as a machine that consumed the defenseless. When the war ended weeks later, celebrations erupted. Flags waved. Bands played. Soldiers kissed strangers. Yet beneath every parade lay the shadow of that train. Victory felt hollow. Triumph tasted like ash. No victory justified what had been discovered. No anthem erased the screams heard in that forest. The world had been shown what mankind could become when hatred fused with technology, when bureaucracy replaced conscience, when numbers replaced names. Years later at trials, prosecutors displayed photographs taken inside the wagons. Surviving soldiers testified with voices that shook, describing the smell, the silence, the weight. Judges listened with faces drained of color. Jurors wept openly. The verdicts were inevitable, but the punishment could never equal the crime. The train was dismantled. Some wagons were preserved and placed in museums as hollow tombs of remembrance. Others were destroyed, metal melted down, and reshaped into tools for rebuilding. The rails were torn up and trees replanted. The forest slowly reclaimed the ground where screams once echoed. Grass grew over footprints. Moss covered steel. Birds returned. But for the men who opened those doors, forgetting was impossible. They carried the memory into old age, retelling it only in fragments, voices trembling. Some never spoke of it again. Some woke nightly to the sound of knocking inside their skulls. Some avoided trains for the rest of their lives. The war did not end for them. It only changed shape. What Americans found inside that captured German train shocked the world, not because it was unimaginable, but because it was real. It forced humanity to stare into a mirror polished with blood and see itself without disguise. It demanded a reckoning that reached beyond victory and punishment and into the core of what civilization pretends to be. When the forest grew quiet again and the last soldiers departed, a silence settled deeper than the night before discovery. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of grief and responsibility and warning. The rails rusted. The wind whispered through the trees. And the world changed. When the echoes finally faded and the horizon cleared, only one truth remained. Memory is the only defense against repetition. Forgetting is surrender. And silence is the first weapon of those who build trains for darkness. When the sea of time calmed and the smoke of history thinned, only the echoes of range remained, measured not in miles or weapons, but in the distance between what humanity promises and what it becomes.